Hello, everybody. Hello. Right, so we're going to talk about this today in my 20 minutes. But before I get started, just a quick question to the audience. Is there anybody here today that doesn't have a mobile phone? Good. Around 94% of adults in the UK own a mobile phone. And in many ways, these devices have kind of become modern-day town criers. They allowed us to broadcast the entire world what we're doing at any given moment, whether it's through email, whether it's social media or RSS notifications. Our little boxes in our pockets don't miss a thing. And we've all been there, we've all been out with our friends or our spouses, or we've been at work and we get that little vibration in our pocket, or we see a notification flash up on our screen and we just can't fight the urge to unlock our phones and see what's going on. So what if you could use that technology to communicate information to people in an emergency? That's kind of the premise that we're going to look at today. We'll skip this. Most of you are familiar with Fireco, I'd imagine. If you're not, come and have a chat at lunch and I'll bring you up to speed. We'll go straight into this. I don't want to teach anyone how to suck eggs, but just in case you don't know, the point of an evacuation is to take people from an area of danger to an area of relative safety. And when we plan an evacuation, we tend to have expectations for the occupants of our premises. We expect them to understand fire alarm signals. We expect them to be able to follow signage out of the building and make their way to a muster point. We expect them to follow the best route out of the building. But how are we communicating that information? How do we tell people where the nearest muster point is or where they need to do? Now, in reality, evacuations, especially for those unfamiliar with our buildings, tend to be messy and confusing, and sometimes they take a little bit longer than we'd like. Statistically speaking, about 25% of people would look to see what everybody else in the building was doing. 13% would just ignore the fire alarm completely. A small majority would try and find the fire, whether it's out of morbid curiosity or to try and deal with it themselves, I can't tell you. And in a recent survey that we conducted at Fireco, about 85% of people would happily go back for their mobile devices, and that's far higher than the rate people would go back for bags and coats and other belongings. Even the National Fire Chiefs Council have acknowledged that the most common reaction to a fire alarm is inaction, and that very often people need a second stimulus before they take the action that we want them to take. And this second stimulus is very often provided in the form of a fire warden or a person of authority telling them that, yes, they do actually have to get out of the building. And what's the first thing that people are going to do when they leave your building? Invariably, it's this. They're going to start tweeting and Facebooking and Snapchat. I think that's the thing now. Instagram, TikTok. They're going to start shouting about your evacuation on social media. So if people are going to be that hell-bent on their phones, you know, it's well known that we've become quite dependent on mobile devices, a bit of a codependent relationship going on there. Why not use that technology to make your evacuations more engaging and to make them easier to understand? Like it says there. So I'm just going to run you through what digital messaging services are, just to try and familiarise you with the general sort of gist of what they can do. So a digital messaging service will send alerts directly to people's mobile devices, whether it's through an app, through a text message, WhatsApp, email alert. It's all done digitally, as the name might suggest. Predominantly, they're cloud-based. Some we do find hardware that's built into the device itself, but predominantly cloud-based. They tend to be much more cost-effective and easier to manage than pager systems and RF solutions. Certainly, if you're asking people to use their own mobile devices, you don't have to worry about a drawer full of pages which will either go missing or just sit there gathering dust. So digital messaging services, as I say, they send alerts directly through to people's mobile devices. And they've got various other applications as well, not just for fire alarm notifications, but it could be for fire alarm faults. It could be for monitoring air conditioning equipment or the activation of security alarms. digital messaging services can be integrated with most electrical devices with a set of outputs, allowing you to have all that information and send it directly to people at their fingertips. So there are currently no guidance or legislation notes specifically for digital messaging services, but there's plenty of other legislation and guidance that we can look at to get an understanding of what we need to do. The RRFSO has been mentioned quite a few times. It doesn't really go into too much detail about how products and services should operate, but it does say that people in the building need to be made aware of a fire and that they understand your evacuation processes. And the same is repeated in the Fire Scotland Act and similar UK fire legislation. Building regulations, again, I'm not going to teach how to suck eggs, but they don't give any other kind of information on how people should be notified to a fire alarm, other than to say that sufficient early warning of fire for persons in the building should be provided. Now, the Equality Act 2010, this is an interesting one because obviously this covers people with sensory impairments, particularly hearing impairments, and it requires that services are provided as a standard rather than reactive. So if you're waiting for a hearing impaired person to come into your building before you think about visual alert devices or pages or whatever you're going to use, you could be in breach of the Equality Act. So you need to have services like this in place as standard, just like we do with accessibility ramps. Leaving that out could lead you down quite a slippery path. So BS 5839 Part 1, 2017, very familiar standard, I'm sure, for a lot of people in the room. This is the standard, the installation and maintenance standard for fire alarm systems, and clause 18 of this standard is very often applied specifically for hearing impaired people. And what it says is, no British standard specifications for alarm devices for people who are deaf and hard of hearing are available at present in the UK. Nevertheless, wherever possible, the recommendation of this clause ought to be followed, and any variations ought to be subject to a risk assessment to ensure that no person who is deaf or hard of hearing is due to undue risk. It's like any standard, you can apply a variation. I think it's clause 7 of 5839 Part 1. So if you were to look at a digital messaging service specifically for hearing impaired people, you'd need to look in more detail at this and apply a variation. But if you're using it for other purposes on site as well, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to use the same service for everybody in the building. And BS 8629, so this is very new standard for evacuation systems for the use of fire and rescue services. This is not applicable to what we're talking about today, but I just wanted to highlight it just in case there's any confusion about whether or not the sort of systems I'm talking about would be applicable under this standard, that they're not within the scope of this document. Health and Safety Act at work. Everything in here is done by so far as is reasonably practicable. So I think, as Maz touched on earlier, if the cost benefits outweigh the risk of implementing a procedure or a piece of technology, then you can get away with not doing it. But again, you've got to risk assess everything. Risk assessment is key in fire safety. We all know that. Do your risk assessment, speak to manufacturers, speak to the people that you're going to use the system with, especially disabled people, as to whether or not this is the right measure for them. And we've got GDPR. So any system that captures phone numbers and email addresses needs to be GDPR compliant. Any manufacturer providing a digital messaging service should be able to satisfy the GDPR requirements. And again, it's about communication. It's about talking to manufacturers and making sure that they've done the right things. So, in the planning stage of an evacuation, we have to think about the basics, like what we want people to actually do. And depending on the nature of the premises, the level of complexity of its ingress and egress systems, what we want people to do in an evacuation can have massive implications on the sort of evacuation plan you put in place. So we have to think about what behaviours we want to see. We have to think about where we want people to go. And we have to consider the needs of people with mobility and sensory impairments. We have to think about the routes that we want people to take and make sure they're easy to follow. Especially for those that are unfamiliar with the building. And more importantly, this all has to be communicated clearly and concisely, because if your evacuation plan isn't clear and engaging, people are going to struggle to understand what you want them to do. So as with all things where we rely on cooperation between various different systems, people and processes, communication is king. And this is where digital messaging services can play a crucial part in effective evacuations. And so what is a second stimulus? This is something I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the National Fire Chiefs Council. A second stimulus is something other than the fire alarm that gives them a kick up the bum. It says, you need to do something now because there's an alarm going off. So second stimulus is really, really important. As I mentioned, it's very often in the form of a fire warden. How long does that conversation between the evacuee and the fire warden have to take before that person starts actually moving? Is that safe for your fire wardens to keep them in the building for longer than necessary when there are other ways you could get that second stimulus out to people? So consternation is one of the biggest factors in delayed evacuations. So the sooner you can back up the first stimulus of the audible fire alarm signal with a second stimulus, the quicker you can get people moving in the right direction. And once people have left the building, what are you going to do then? So obviously roll call is very common, help you ascertain whether or not anybody's left inside the building or is unaccounted for. But this is only really functional in a building where you know what the occupancy is. If it's a hospital or a shopping centre, somewhere where you've got transient occupants coming in and out all the time, it's very difficult to do a roll call because you just don't know who's in the building. And here's an idea that a lot of premises are kicking around at the moment, is it safe to have large groups of people congregating outside your building when there's a fire? Is that going to set them up to other risks? If you look at this photo here from one of our fire drills a few years ago in our old building, we've got a new one now, you can see the crowd is gathered next to a busy road. There's scaffolding outside. If there was a fire that could cause the scaffolding to collapse, there's all kinds of reasons why you might not want people gathering outside your building. So sometimes an evacuate and disperse policy is more preferable. And what this does is it goes, right, there's something going on, go away, we'll tell you when it's safe to all come back. So again, in these situations, a digital messaging service would be perfect because first of all, they get a text saying they need to leave, and then they get a text saying that they need to come back. Whether or not they come back or spend the rest of the day in the pub is not my problem. And bear in mind, we don't just evacuate for fire. There are all kinds of different evacuations, such as terror threats. We get gas chemical leaks, we get natural disasters. Sometimes we don't evacuate at all. Sometimes we in-evacuate, which is normally for security alerts, but that's where we take a group of people and take them to a secure location while the responsible people try and deal with the situation that's going on. So I wanted to give you a real-world example. This is under 4 minutes, so we're going to be on time. This is one of our case studies with City of London Corporation, who have used our DMS service for various different ways.
The Guildhall itself, the event space in the Great Hall where we're sitting today, dates back from 1410. The Guildhall complex has about 1,600 staff based here, which is the headquarters for this City of London. And we are very much like a local council, and we manage a variety of services from the Guildhall complex, ranging from police headquarters, art gallery, event space, and general office area. DMS, having installed in the Guildhall complex, helped us to manage our INVAC system, that we can get all staff to move to a safer area within the confines of our complex, down to the basement in a safe, orderly fashion. The DMS system was instrumental in allowing us to communicate with up to potentially 2,000 staff members at any one time, and asking them to move to the designated safe area as quickly as possible. The DMS system has helped us manage our fire alarm system. So it alerts us when we go into pre-alarm, when an activation has occurred, so we've got time to activate it within the 5 minutes. After the 5 minutes, we go into a full fire evacuation. Once we're in a full fire evacuation, the DMS system will then send an alert all our staff via text message to say that we're in full activation and not to turn to site and to evacuate using their nearest exits. What you want to do is you do a roll call and then a dispersal system. And where the DMS kicks in and it helps us, that once you've done your roll call and 2,000 members of staff disperse, how do you get them to come back to the Guildhall when it is safe to do so? By pressing a button on our fire alarm system using the technologies from the DMS, we can then send a text message to all our staff saying, Guildhall is safe to return, please return as soon as possible. It provides key information to senior managers. So for us, it's very much beneficial and helps us maintain our legal compliance with regard to fire.
The City of London Corporation has also used the Fireco digital messaging service in its pipe subways stroke cable tunnels. For people who may not be aware that in Victorian times they didn't just build sewers but pipe subways to take the services of electrical supplies and telecommunications. We have a system in there of fire detection, but there was no way of releasing that signal to a control room to alert people to a fire unless they were in the actual premises in the pipe subway itself. Fireco came up with a solution with a digital messaging service to send that to our central control room, which is manned 24 hours a day. We are delighted to work with Fireco on a number of projects. The most recent is for the digital messaging service to be installed in Tower Bridge to protect one of England's most historic assets.
Our relationship and workings with DMS and Fireco are brilliant. It's very much based on a cohesive partnership. So any faults, any queries that we have, we get the information that we require in a quick, easy manner, and throughout the entire process from installation to ongoing management of the systems and requiring additional information. Fireco and the DMS system are second to none, helping us manage our staff with regard to alarms, evacuation, and returning them safely to the Guildhall complex.
City of London Corporation for helping us with that case study. They've been really good to actually come to us with various different ideas, and obviously I'm going to come and tell you how good my ideas are. So it's really nice to have someone that's not paid by these guys to do that. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'm not going to read out the bullet points because I'm sure you can all read. But if you do have any questions or comments, come and see me at lunchtime. I'm now going to move out the way for Jeremy. Thank you very much for your time.